It was the kind of night when no one should have been out there. The kind of Montana cold that stripped the feeling from your bones and erased the horizon into a wall of white. Wind howled across the empty highway, blowing snow so thick it blurred the lines between earth and sky. Out in that blizzard, where even the cattle had been brought inside for winter safety, a lone figure trudged forward, slow, steady, half-broken. Ethan Hale kept one hand wrapped around the strap of his torn duffel, the other resting on the shoulders of Ranger, his aging K-9 partner. The dog leaned into him, ribs rising and falling in short, shallow breaths. Every few steps, Ranger stumbled, leaving faint smears of blood in the snow, the red swallowed instantly by the storm. Ethan didn't say much anymore. But tonight, with the wind screaming in his ears and the cold biting like a wild animal, he whispered down to the dog, "Hang in there, buddy. Don't quit on me now." They had walked for miles, hours maybe. Time felt strange when the world was just white, wind, and the fragile sound of a dog struggling to breathe. Ethan had been a Navy SEAL for 15 years, survived mortar fire, drowning drills, nights in deserts where even the moon felt cruel. But nothing felt as brutal as watching Ranger limp beside him under a sky that did not care whether they lived or died. He had lost his team, lost the structure that once held him up, lost the steady paycheck, the health coverage, the home insurance, all the things that came with a life he no longer had. Now it was just him and Ranger. Two worn-down souls drifting through the loneliness of Montana. A violent gust slammed into them, nearly knocking Ethan off balance. He braced himself, shielding Ranger with his body. "Easy, boy. We're close to something. Gotta be." But the truth was harsher. Ethan didn't know if they'd make it through the night. The weather alerts had called it one of the worst blizzards of the decade, a life-threatening event. The radio had said that right before his truck died outside Billings, leaving them stranded. He'd spent 2 nights under an overpass, Ranger curled against him. But not tonight. Not with the storm building. Not with Ranger weakening by the hour. Ethan squinted into the swirling dark. Snow whipped through the air, piling in his beard, clinging to his jacket. And then, far off, a light. Maybe a reflection. Maybe a trick of the storm. But then the wind shifted, and the faint glow sharpened into a warm, golden pulse. A house. A real house. Out here. In the middle of nowhere. "Come on, Ranger," Ethan whispered. "We might have gotten lucky for once." He adjusted the duffel and lifted Ranger's front half just enough to steady him. Together they pushed forward, step by step, the storm clawing at them like a living thing. As they neared the farmhouse, Ethan saw fence posts buried in snow, a frozen pasture, the dark outline of a barn, and above it all, a single amber light glowing from a window, soft and warm like a promise of safety. Ranger stumbled again, collapsing to one knee. Ethan caught him, pressing his forehead to the dog's. "Don't you leave me. You hear? I've still got you. I've always got you." Slowly, painfully, they reached the front steps. The storm roared behind them, as if urging them toward one last chance at survival. Ethan lifted his fist, his knuckles numb, pale, close to frostbite. He hesitated, not out of pride, but fear. Fear that whoever lived here would turn them away. Still, he knocked. The sound was small, nearly swallowed by the wind. But inside, the light flickered. Someone had heard. Ethan exhaled, his voice barely a breath. "Please, someone be home." Ranger trembled beside him. And then, just as the storm reached its peak, the porch light switched on, casting a warm circle onto the snow, a doorway into hope, a doorway into the rest of their story. The porch light glowed like a fragile halo in the storm, cutting a small circle of gold into the swirling white. Ethan stood hunched beneath it, Ranger trembling at his feet. He could barely feel his fingers as he knocked again, louder this time. Each tap a plea he was too proud to voice. Inside, footsteps moved across creaking floorboards. A shadow shifted behind the frosted glass. Ethan straightened, brushing snow from Ranger's back, trying, foolishly, to look less like a man drowning on dry land. The door opened a crack. Warm air rolled out first, rich with wood smoke and baked corn casserole. Then a woman's face appeared, lined with years, with winter, and with something heavier than either. Her gray hair pulled back in a loose knot, her eyes sharp even in the dim light. She studied Ethan and the dog, as if deciding whether they belonged to the world of danger or the world of mercy. "What is it?" she asked, her voice as hard as the wind outside. Ethan cleared his throat, though the cold had stolen half his voice. "Ma'am, I'm sorry to bother you. It's freezing out here. My dog, Ranger, he's not doing well. We just need a place to stay for the night. The barn would be fine. Just the barn." Years of discipline made him stand straighter than his exhaustion allowed. The woman, Martha Collins, lifted her lantern, letting its glow wash over Ranger. The dog's legs buckled slightly. Martha's brow tightened, but not with sympathy. Something closer to fear or memory. "We don't take strangers here," she said, brisk and sharp. "Not in the middle of a storm. Not any other night, either." Her words hit harder than the wind. Ethan lowered his gaze. Humility wasn't foreign to him. But this felt like a verdict. Snow clung to his eyelashes. His lips trembled. Whether from cold or shame, he couldn't tell. "I understand, ma'am," he said, softly. "I just thought I'd ask. For him." Ranger pressed against his leg, whimpering. Ethan knelt slowly, easing the dog into his arms. The movement drew Martha's attention again, her gaze lingering on the blood matting Ranger's fur. "You two shouldn't be out in this," she muttered. Ethan gave a hollow laugh. "Believe me, ma'am, we'd rather be anywhere else." Her eyes flicked to the faded patch on his jacket. "You military?" "Was." The word clawed at his throat. Yes, ma'am. Navy SEAL. Retired. He didn't add not by choice. He didn't add because I couldn't save them. He didn't add because I lost myself out there. Martha's expression didn't soften. It hardened. The kind of hardness born from loss. The kind that builds walls too tall for compassion to climb. Well, she said, clipped, we still don't take strangers. She began to close the door. Panic surged through Ethan's chest, not for himself, but for Ranger. He stepped forward instinctively, sharp enough that Martha tightened her grip. Ma'am, wait. I'm not asking for much. He's old. He served this country longer than most people ever will. If you can't let us both stay, just let him have a roof. Just one night. Martha's eyes flickered. The storm howled, pushing cold into every corner of the porch. For the first time, uncertainty crept across her face. Ranger lifted his head, looking at her with tired brown eyes clouded by pain, but still gentle, still loyal. Something in Martha shifted, a seam in a long-shut door cracking under its own weight. But still, she shook her head. Right throat 87% pitch. First. No, she said, though her voice wavered. That barn is too old, too cold. It can barely keep a cow warm. We've survived worse, Ethan whispered. Martha looked at him again. Really looked. The snow in his beard, the tremble in his shoulders, the way he held Ranger like a lifeline he couldn't lose. For a moment, she hesitated. Just a moment. Then she closed the door. Not all the way, but enough. Ethan stood there, snow settling on his shoulders again. Ranger let out a soft, aching sound, pressing his face into Ethan's chest. It's all right, buddy. We'll figure something out. As he turned away from the porch and stepped back into the storm, a faint sliver of light slipped out from the door Martha hadn't fully shut. And from inside, through the glass, she watched them walk toward the barn. Her hand frozen on the doorknob, her breath trembling with something she had spent years refusing to feel. Snow swallowed the sound of Ethan's footsteps as he moved away from the porch. The weak light behind him dimmed again, retreating into the house like a frightened animal. Ranger limped beside him, each step slower than the last. Ethan adjusted his grip on the dog, letting Ranger lean most of his weight into him. They reached the side of the barn, an old wooden structure battered by years of harsh winters. The roof sagged. The boards rattled with every gust. This was no shelter, not truly. But it was the only thing standing between them and the kind of cold that killed quietly. Ethan crouched, setting Ranger down gently. His knees nearly buckled beneath him, the fatigue finally sharpening into pain. Ranger whimpered, nudging his head under Ethan's palm. That simple, tired gesture, one he'd felt 1,000 times, nearly broke him. I'm sorry, buddy, Ethan whispered, his voice shaking. I'm trying. I swear I'm trying. Wind tore through the open field, stinging his eyes and burning his throat. He lowered his head until his forehead touched Ranger's, their breaths mingling in pale clouds, The storm quickly carried away. He wanted to scream. He wanted to beg the sky for one damn break. But all he could manage was a quiet apology to the only living soul who had stayed by his side through hell and back. A sudden roar of an engine cut through the storm. Headlights carved through the darkness, blinding. A pickup truck barreled down the road and slowed as it passed the barn. The driver rolled down his window just long enough to shout, "Get off the road, drifter!" The truck sped away, tires spraying slush. Ethan closed his eyes. The humiliation hit harder than the cold. In another life, people saluted him, trusted him, counted on him. Now he was nothing more than a burden to passers-by. A man with no home, no uniform, no worth in their eyes. He swallowed the knot in his throat and pulled Ranger closer, his fingers trembling as he checked the dog's injured leg. "We'll make it through this," Ethan murmured. "We have to." A gust of wind slammed the barn doors open, revealing the dim, dusty interior. It wasn't warm. It wasn't even safe. But at least it blocked the worst of the storm. Ethan lifted Ranger in his arms, a task that once felt easy, now crushing under exhaustion, and carried him inside. He laid the dog onto an old pile of hay. Ranger curled up, his breathing shallow but steady. Ethan pressed his hand to Ranger's chest, feeling the heartbeat that had guided him through chaos overseas. The heartbeat that reminded him he could still be something more than a man broken by war. "You saved my life more times than anyone knows," Ethan whispered. "You kept me human, even when I didn't deserve it." Lightning cracked in the distance, illuminating the barn for a heartbeat. Dust and cobwebs danced in the air, and Ethan felt the weight of their loneliness pressing in from all sides. He needed a miracle, even a small one. Just enough to keep Ranger alive until morning. Ethan stepped outside to gather fallen lumber to patch a hole in the barn wall. Snow pelted him viciously, clinging to his coat, freezing his hands. He worked quickly, sloppily, anything to slow the cold creeping into the barn. When he turned back toward the house, he noticed a faint glow. The porch light had turned on again. Just as Ethan stared at it through the storm, the front door cracked open, only an inch, and warm light spilled onto the snow. Inside that doorway, Martha Collins stood motionless, holding her lantern. Her jaw tightened as she watched Ethan kneel beside Ranger, brushing ice from the dog's muzzle. She didn't step outside. She didn't call to him. But she stayed, watching, unsure. Something inside her shifting like frost breaking under the first touch of morning light. Ethan didn't notice her. He simply sat beside Ranger, his voice barely more than a breath. "Don't give up, boy. Not tonight." And from the porch, Martha's hand trembled around the lantern handle, her heart torn between the walls she'd built, and the memory of a son who once loved a dog just as fiercely. The storm raged on, pounding against the barn roof, as if Montana itself were testing the limits of human endurance. Ethan sat beside Ranger, rubbing the dog's ears to keep him awake, breathing in the cold, dusty air. The barn creaked with every gust, trembling like an old memory that didn't want to be disturbed. A faint crunch of snow carried through the wind. Ethan looked up just as a warm circle of lantern light spilled across the barn floorboards. Martha Collins stood in the doorway, her coat pulled tight around her shoulders, her breath curling into the air like smoke. For a long moment, she didn't step inside. She simply watched Ethan, watched the way he shielded Ranger from the cold with his own body. Her eyes weren't hard anymore. They were searching. Ethan rose slowly, wiping straw from his knees. Ranger lifted his head, his tail tapping once against the ground in a weary greeting. Martha held the lantern higher. "You shouldn't be out here," she said. But the sharpness from earlier had softened, replaced by something more fragile. "This barn isn't fit for a sick dog or a man." Ethan kept his voice respectful, steady. "Ma'am, I don't want trouble. We just needed somewhere out of the wind. It's only for tonight." Her gaze drifted to Ranger's injured leg. Blood had dried into the fur, despite Ethan's attempts to clean it. Martha inhaled sharply, the sight unsettling her more than she wanted to admit. "How did he get hurt?" Her voice trembled, almost too quiet to catch under the wind. Ethan hesitated. He hadn't intended to share anything. Not here, not with a stranger whose world did not include him. But something about her tone, uncertain, almost grieving, opened a door inside him he hadn't touched in years. "Time tones. He saved me," Ethan said finally. "On our last mission." The words came out rough, unfinished. "We were ambushed, lost half the team before we even knew what hit us. Ranger pulled me out before the whole damn building collapsed." Martha swallowed. Her hand tightened around the lantern handle until her knuckles whitened. "And after all that, you end up here?" She gestured vaguely toward the broken barn, the empty fields, the blizzard refusing to let up. Ethan gave a small, tired nod. "War doesn't always follow you home the way you expect." His voice softened. "Some of us lose more afterward than we did over there." Martha stepped forward at last, her boots sinking into straw. The lantern light revealed her face, the deep lines of worry, the shadows under her eyes, the ache she tried to hide behind her practical composure. She looked at Ethan differently now, as if seeing him not as a stranger, but as a story she hadn't finished reading. "You look like you haven't slept in days," she murmured. "And that dog, he's older than he should be for that kind of work." "He's earned rest," Ethan said. "More than I can give him." Silence filled the barn. Thick, heavy, complex. Outside, the wind wailed, but inside, it was only the three of them, bound by something neither of them understood yet. Martha crouched beside Ranger. The dog stared at her with the tired dignity of a soldier who'd given everything he had. She hesitated before reaching out, her hand trembling as she touched his fur. "He's warm," she whispered, "but not warm enough." Ethan shifted, uneasy. "I'll take care of him, ma'am. Always have." Martha rose, wiping her hands on her coat. "Wait here." She left the barn without another word. Ethan assumed she was finally sending them away, calling a sheriff, or telling him to move on before dawn. His stomach tightened, bracing for another blow. But minutes later, Martha returned. She carried a small metal tin and a roll of clean bandages. She knelt again, setting the lantern beside Ranger. "I don't know how much this will help, but it's what I have." Ethan exhaled slowly. Relief washed over him, sharp enough to almost hurt. "Thank you," he whispered. She didn't answer, but her hands, steady despite the tremble in her breath, told him everything he needed to know. The storm roared on, but inside that barn, something fragile and human had begun to thaw. Which part of this chapter moved you the most? 1, 2, or 3? Comment your number below so I can keep the story flowing in the way you enjoy most. The storm eased, just enough for Ethan to hear Ranger's breathing. Thin, uneven, strained in a way that struck deeper fear than any battlefield ever had. The barn felt colder now, even with the patched wall holding back most of the wind. Lantern light flickered across the wooden beams, casting long shadows that swayed like memories Ethan wished he could forget. Ranger lay curled on the makeshift bedding of hay and the old saddle blanket Martha had silently left behind. His chest rose and fell with the slow heaviness of exhaustion. His paws twitched, as if trapped in a dream he couldn't outrun. Ethan knelt beside him, removing his gloves and placing both hands against Ranger's fur. The warmth was fading. Not gone, but slipping. Too fast. "You stay with me," Ethan whispered, bending close so Ranger could hear the familiar voice that had guided him through years of gunfire, rubble, and night ops. "You hear me, Ranger? You hold on." Ranger blinked, trying to lift his head. Ethan steadied him gently, rubbing the dog's jaw to calm the tremor running through him. The sight hollowed Ethan's chest. He had seen Ranger wounded before, but never this worn, never this fragile. Age had crept up on them both, but it seemed crueler on Ranger, stealing strength from the dog who had given all of his to protect Ethan. The memory came without warning. Heat, smoke, screams muffled under collapsing walls. Ethan trapped beneath a shattered beam, unable to move, dust filling his lungs, and then Ranger bursting through the wreckage, teeth gripping Ethan's sleeve, dragging him inch by inch toward daylight. Ethan hadn't understood how the dog had found him, or how he had pushed past his own injuries. But he remembered the feeling of Ranger's heartbeat pounding through the dust and chaos like a lifeline. "You saved me," Ethan murmured, brushing snowmelt from Ranger's fur. "More times than anyone knows." Ranger nudged Ethan's wrist weakly, as if reminding him that loyalty wasn't something that faded with age. Ethan swallowed hard. The truth pressed against him with brutal certainty. Ranger needed real warmth, real care. A vet, maybe meds, maybe long-term help pet insurance never fully covered. Ethan had none of that now. Not the income. Not the veteran's benefits he'd never filed for. Not the mental health support people kept urging him to seek. What he had was Ranger, and Ranger had him. That had always been enough. Until tonight, when the cold demanded more than love alone could give. Ethan drew Ranger into his arms, holding him the way he wished someone had held him after the war. Without fear, without judgment, without asking for anything in return. Ranger rested his chin against Ethan's shoulder, exhaling a low, gravelly breath. The sound tightened something deep in Ethan's throat. "I should have taken better care of you," Ethan whispered. "I should have found us a place, a real home, not miles of road and freezing nights." Ranger's tail tapped once, barely perceptible, a quiet forgiveness. Ethan pressed his forehead against Ranger's, letting the lantern light soften the ache behind his eyes. No one else in the world knew how close Ethan had come to the edge. The nights he'd stared at nothing, the days he'd walked without purpose. Ranger had kept him alive long after the uniforms were folded and stored away. Ranger had been the one constant when the world felt too large, too loud, too empty. "I can't lose you," Ethan breathed. "Not like this. Not out here." The barn door creaked. Ethan tensed, instinct returning like muscle memory. Silent, alert, waiting. But it wasn't danger. It was Martha's silhouette in the doorway, her lantern lifting again, her expression unreadable. She looked at Ranger first, then at Ethan, at the way he held the dog like he was cradling the last piece of hope he had left. Her jaw tightened, her breath caught. The storm outside had softened. But inside the barn, something heavier gathered. The weight of a decision Martha hadn't yet made, but could no longer avoid. Ethan didn't speak. He didn't plead. He simply held Ranger closer, letting Martha see the truth laid bare. Two souls standing at the edge, waiting for a kindness that might not come in time. The lantern in Martha's hand shook slightly. Something in her was shifting. The wind roared again, louder this time, rattling the barn doors like a warning from the night itself. Ethan felt the temperature drop sharply, an invisible knife sliding under his coat, stiffening his fingers as he held Ranger closer. The dog shivered uncontrollably now, small tremors moving across his ribcage. Ethan's heartbeat quickened with every uneven breath Ranger took. Footsteps crunched in the snow. Martha appeared again in the doorway, her lantern glowing like a frail sun struggling to warm the dark. She didn't step inside immediately. She stood there, shoulders tight beneath her heavy coat, eyes fixed on Ranger. The storm pressed at her back, swirling through the gap in the door. "His breathing," Martha said quietly. "It doesn't sound right." Ethan nodded, brushing a hand across Ranger's muzzle. "It's getting worse." His voice cracked. "Ma'am, please. I'm running out of ways to keep him awake. He's old. He's hurting. He won't make it out here." Martha's lips pressed into a thin line. Wind whipped strands of gray hair across her face. Something flickered in her eyes. Fear, memory, hesitation, tangled into a knot she couldn't undo. "I told you," she said firmly, though her voice shook. "I don't take strangers in my home." Ethan rose slowly, Ranger's weight cradled in his arms. He staggered, not because Ranger was too heavy, but because exhaustion gnawed at him from every angle. He carried the dog to the edge of the barn's doorway, where the lantern light brushed across Ranger's fur. "Ma'am," Ethan's breath hitched. "If you can't take us, both, at least take him. Please." He served this country longer than most people ever will. He deserves warmth. Just a roof. Ranger whimpered softly, as if pleading for himself. Martha's gaze dropped to the dog's injured leg, then to the frost gathering at the corners of Ethan's beard. The storm howled again, sending a burst of cold air into the barn that made Ranger flinch. Ethan tightened his hold. "I'm not asking for a bed. I'm not asking for food. You can lock the door, call the sheriff, anything you want. Just let him rest somewhere warm." His voice broke entirely. "I'll stay outside if I have to." The honesty in his voice cut through the storm's roar. This wasn't pride anymore. It wasn't dignity. It was primal. A man begging for the life of the only companion he had left. Martha's breath quivered. She turned her head away, blinking hard. She wasn't a cruel woman. She never had been. But years of grief had taught her to shut doors before sorrow could walk in again. She had told herself she was protecting her peace, her safety, her memories. Yet here, in this dim barn filled with cold straw and two fading souls, her walls began to crack. Ranger tried to lift his head, offering a faint wag of his tail, a gesture so small, yet so familiar it pierced something deep inside Martha's chest. "You said his name is Ranger?" she asked, though she already knew the answer. Ethan nodded. "Yes, ma'am." Her hand trembled around the lantern handle. She closed her eyes for a long moment, gathering a breath that didn't steady her the way she hoped. When she finally looked at Ethan, something wounded glimmered beneath her sternness. She opened her mouth, then closed it again, shaking her head as though fighting a battle inside herself. "I can't," she whispered, but the word held no conviction. "I can't." Then she turned sharply, retreating toward the farmhouse. Snow swallowed her figure as the lantern light bobbed away, leaving Ethan standing in the barn doorway, Ranger pressed against his chest. He watched her disappear, the cold creeping up his arms, tightening his throat. A hollow ache swelled inside him. Not anger, not despair, but a quiet surrender he had never felt before. He held Ranger tighter. "It's okay, boy," he murmured. "I'm here. I'm not leaving you." The barn settled into silence again, but not entirely, because from the house, through the blizzard, a window glowed bright. Martha's silhouette lingered behind the glass, unable to turn away from the sight of the man and dog bracing themselves against death's quiet approach. Something inside her was cracking, and the storm knew it. Night settled over the valley like a heavy curtain, thick, unmoving. The blizzard had shifted from furious to relentless, no longer thrashing, but pressing down with a cold so dense it felt alive. Snow piled against the barn walls, muting every sound except the shallow rasp of Ranger's breathing. Ethan sat with his back to the wooden boards. Ranger curled against his side. He wrapped both arms around the dog, letting his own body heat work as a poor excuse for emergency shelter. The barn air smelled of dust, old leather, and the faint sweetness of hay, normally comforting in Montana winters, but tonight they felt like reminders of everything slipping out of reach. Ranger twitched in his sleep, paws trembling. Ethan stroked his head, whispering quietly, "Easy, buddy, I'm right here." His voice was raw, scraped from the inside. Ranger settled, but only for a moment. Wind pushed through a crack in the boards, carrying flakes of snow that melted instantly against Ethan's skin. He shivered, but not from the cold alone. Exhaustion carved into him with a slow, merciless hand. His shoulders slumped, his eyes burned, his breath clouded in tired bursts. He had felt fear before. Fear in the field, fear in the dark, fear counting the men who didn't make it home. But this fear was different. This was the fear of losing the one life that had held his own together long after the world stopped making sense. Ranger's breathing stuttered again. Ethan tightened his embrace, murmuring, "I've got you, Ranger. I've got you. I should have found us a place. Should have done better." The barn door creaked softly, shifting in the wind. Ethan lifted his head. Through the narrow gap, he saw a faint glow from Martha's living room window. A silhouette stood there, still as a statue, watching. He didn't move. Neither did she. Minutes stretched. The storm groaned. Ranger whimpered in his sleep. Ethan bowed over the dog, forehead resting against Ranger's neck. "Don't leave me tonight," he whispered, voice breaking. "Not like this. Not out here." He wasn't a man who cried easily. Not on missions, not in hospitals, not even at funerals where he folded flags into trembling hands. But tonight, in this forgotten barn in the middle of Montana, tears stung his eyes and blurred the lantern light. He wiped them away quickly, almost angrily, as if ashamed of being human. Ranger shifted again, trying to curl tighter. Ethan felt a cold panic rise, sharp, breath-stealing. He cupped Ranger's face gently, whispering, "Stay awake, boy. Stay with me. You're my last piece of home." The barn air thickened with silence. Then, a thud. A muffled sound from the house. Ethan looked toward the window. The silhouette was gone. For a second, hope flickered. Soft, hesitant, desperate. The back door of the farmhouse opened, spilling warm yellow light onto the snow. Martha stepped out, a coat thrown over her nightdress, her boots crunching fast and uneven across the frozen ground. She moved with a purpose she hadn't shown before. Something urgent, almost frightened. Ethan didn't call out. He couldn't. His voice tangled in his throat as Martha crossed the yard, the lantern swinging wildly in her hand. She reached the barn door and stopped, not from hesitation, but from shock at seeing them up close. Ethan hunched over Ranger like a man praying at an altar made of fur and fading breath. Ranger lifted his head weakly at the sight of her. Martha's breath trembled. Her eyes glistened, not with pity, but with recognition. She pressed a hand to her chest, as if steadying a heart that had suddenly fallen out of rhythm. Ethan looked up at her finally, eyes hollow with fear he no longer tried to hide. "Ma'am," he whispered, "he's slipping." Martha stared at them, really stared, and something inside her cracked so completely the storm itself seemed to pause around them. Snow clung to Martha's coat as she stepped fully into the barn, lantern trembling in her hand. The warm glow washed over Ethan and Ranger, revealing a sight that struck her like a forgotten memory dragged suddenly back to life. Ethan's shoulders were hunched around his dog, but it was his face, raw, exhausted, fighting back a breaking heart, that stopped Martha cold. Because for the first time since she'd opened that door hours earlier, she didn't see a stranger. She saw her son. Not in exact features, not in the jawline, not in the hair, but in the way grief lived in Ethan's eyes. Quiet, steady, buried deep, like a wound he'd carried too far for too long. Her breath hitched. Her fingers tightened around the lantern handle until her knuckles glowed white beneath the skin. Ethan noticed. His eyes lifted to hers, searching. For permission, for hope, for any sign she hadn't entirely closed the world off to them. "Ma'am," he murmured, voice hoarse. "Ranger's getting worse." Martha set the lantern down, its light spilling across the hay-strewn floor. She moved closer, slowly, as if approaching a moment she wasn't sure she had the strength to face. Ethan shifted just enough for her to kneel beside Ranger. The dog's chest rose and fell unevenly. His fur, once thick and proud, looked thin under the strain of age and cold. Martha reached out with trembling fingers, not touching yet, simply hovering above him, feeling the faint heat radiating from a body running out of fight. She swallowed hard. "He's been with you long?" Ethan nodded. "Since he was 2. We deployed together. He found men no one else could. Saved lives that wouldn't have made it home. Including mine." Something flickered in Martha's eyes. A memory she didn't want, yet held on to so fiercely it had carved itself into her bones. "My boy," she whispered, voice cracking. "He used to talk about the dogs, said they were the bravest part of the whole damn team." Ethan blinked, stunned by the sudden softening in her voice. Before he could speak, Martha leaned closer, her gaze shifting, warming, in a way he hadn't expected. "Tell me again," she said. "What's your dog's name?" Ethan hesitated, sensing the air thicken with something heavy. He stroked Ranger's head gently. "Ranger. His name is Ranger." The lantern flickered, just slightly, but enough to reveal the shock that rippled across Martha's face. She went still, completely still. The barn, the storm, the cold, all fell away as a memory tore through her like lightning. Her son standing in their kitchen years ago, holding a letter from deployment, smiling in that quiet, tired way only soldiers do. "Mom, you wouldn't believe this dog. Ranger. Smart enough to run the team himself. And his handler, Ethan. Good man. Quiet. Takes care of the dog better than he takes care of himself. Her knees nearly buckled. Ethan noticed the sudden change. "Ma'am," he said softly. "You okay?" Martha pressed a hand to her mouth, tears filling her eyes for the first time in years. She stared at Ethan, not as a stranger, not as a threat, but as a living connection to a son she would never hold again. Her voice trembled violently. "Ethan, your name is Ethan." He nodded slowly, cautious but truthful. "Yes, ma'am. Ethan Hale." It was enough. Martha staggered back a step, lantern light trembling with her. Emotion flooded her eyes. Grief, recognition, devastation, and something else. Something dangerously like hope. She didn't say anything more. She didn't need to. Because Ethan understood in that moment that he wasn't standing in front of a woman hardened by cruelty, but a mother who had buried her son and locked the world out afterward. Ranger let out a soft cry, drawing Martha's attention back to him. And with that sound, small, aching, vulnerable, the fragile wall inside Martha Collins finally cracked open. Which revelation in this chapter gripped you the most? 1, 2, or 3? Comment your number below so I can tune the emotional pacing just right. Martha didn't remember crossing the yard. One moment she was kneeling beside Ranger, her heart thundering against her ribs, and the next she was stumbling back toward the house, boots slipping in the snow. The cold bit at her skin, but she didn't feel it. Not through the storm of recognition crashing over her. Inside the kitchen, she set the lantern on the counter with shaking hands. The old farmhouse was quiet, filled with shadows that had lived there since her son's death. Martha moved mechanically toward the hallway closet, the one she rarely opened. The hinges creaked in protest as she pulled out a wooden box worn soft at the edges. She carried it to the table, sitting slowly, breath unsteady. The storm rattled the windows. Her fingers brushed the lid, then lifted it. Inside lay the pieces of a life she could never fully let go of. Her son's watch. A photograph of him grinning beside a fellow SEAL. A unit patch. His last unopened bag of coffee. And a bundle of letters tied with twine. Letters she'd read so many times she nearly knew them by heart. Her hands trembled as she untied the twine and opened the letter on top, the one she'd never thrown away, though it broke her a little more every time she looked at it. "Mom," it began in her son's tidy handwriting. "There's a guy in my unit, Ethan Hale, quiet as a winter morning, tough as they come. But the way he talks to that dog of his, Ranger, you'd swear the dog was his own blood. If something ever happens to me, I want you to know he's one of the good ones." Martha closed her eyes. A soft sob escaped her, one she hadn't allowed herself in years. She pressed the letter to her chest. Outside, the wind roared, echoing the storm inside her rib cage. The truth seeped through her like warm water into frozen soil, loosening roots she thought had died. Ethan Hale. Ranger. They weren't just names from a story her son once told. They were here. Flesh and bone. Stranded in her barn. Freezing. Hurting. and she had turned them away. Martha stood abruptly, shoving the chair back. She couldn't sit with that knowledge, not while the storm sharpened and the lantern in the barn flickered like a heartbeat fading in the dark. She grabbed her coat, her gloves, her boots. The cold slammed into her as she stepped outside again, lantern swinging wildly. Snow blinded her, stinging her cheeks, melting into the tears she couldn't stop. "Ethan!" she called, her voice almost lost to the storm. The barn loomed ahead like a ghostly shape. She pushed through the drifting snow, breath burning in her lungs. The lantern light bobbed before her, guiding her like a memory refusing to be buried. She reached the barn door and threw it open. Ethan jerked upright, instinct snapping into place. He looked ready to protect Ranger with his life. The sight tightened something in Martha's throat. There was no mistaking it now. The gentleness in his hands, the quiet strength in his posture, the grief behind his eyes. He had carried the same pain she had carried all these years, but he'd carried it alone. "Ethan," she managed, breath trembling. "Wait." He froze, afraid to hope, afraid to trust that tone in her voice. Martha stepped closer. She took in the scene. Ethan kneeling on the cold floor, Ranger limp in his arms, the dog's foggy eyes watching her as if remembering something she couldn't name. Her chest twisted. Her son had spoken of this dog, had spoken of this man. How could she have been so blind? Martha swallowed hard, voice breaking as she spoke the words she never imagined she'd say. I read something tonight." She wiped at her cheeks, though the tears kept coming. "My boy wrote about you, both of you." Ethan stared at her, stunned, speechless. He said Ranger was the bravest soul in the whole damn team. Said you were the kind of man he trusted with his life. Ethan's knees nearly buckled. He clutched Ranger tighter, breath shuddering. "Ma'am, I didn't know he wrote." Martha raised a trembling hand. "You don't have to explain anything. But you're not spending another minute out here." The storm howled behind her, as if urging them forward. "Come with me," she said, voice firm despite the crack in it. "Inside. Now." Ethan blinked, disbelief flooding his face. And then, softly, almost fearfully, he asked, "Are you sure?" Martha nodded once, fiercely. "Ethan Hale," she said through her tears, "you and your dog are coming inside my home." For a moment, Ethan thought he had misheard her. The storm roared behind Martha, swirling snow into a frantic blur of white around her silhouette. But inside the barn, her words hung in the stillness like a miracle trying to take shape. "You and your dog are coming inside my home." Ethan's breath caught. Ranger stirred weakly in his arms, as if responding to a shift in the air his body no longer had the strength to fight for. Ethan blinked hard, emotion rising in him. Raw, unfamiliar, almost frightening. "Ma'am," he whispered, struggling to steady his voice. "I don't want to cause trouble." Martha stepped closer, lantern swinging gently at her side, its glow catching the tears drying on her cheeks. Up close, Ethan could see the grief etched into her features, the weight of memories she'd carried alone for years. Yet beneath all that, there was something new, something open. "You're not causing trouble," she said softly. "You're freezing." And he... Her gaze dropped to Ranger, her throat tightening. "He doesn't have time for pride or distance. Neither do you." Ranger let out a low, aching groan. Martha inhaled sharply, as if the sound pierced through the armor she'd spent years building. Ethan shifted his weight, steadying Ranger in his arms. "I don't know how to thank you," he murmured. "We didn't mean to end up here. My truck died. I've been trying," he swallowed, "trying to make it through the winter without needing anyone." Martha nodded, a sad, knowing look softening her sternness. "I understand. More than you think." She stepped aside, gesturing toward the farmhouse. "Come on, before the cold takes any more from either of you." Ethan hesitated, not out of reluctance but disbelief. For so long he'd lived on the outer edge of the world, surviving on instinct, refusing help even when he needed it more than air. Benefits existed, sure, but navigating them felt harder than any battlefield. Asking for help had never come naturally. Accepting it felt even stranger. But tonight wasn't about him. He held Ranger closer, nodded once, and followed Martha out of the barn and into the blizzard. The walk to the house felt longer than it should have. Wind battered them from all sides, snow crunching beneath their boots in uneven rhythms. Martha walked ahead, shielding the lantern flame with her hand. Ethan trudged behind, careful not to jostle Ranger. When they reached the porch, Martha swung the door open. A wave of warmth rushed out. Heat so immediate, so enveloping, it felt like stepping into another world. The smell of wood smoke, rosemary, and something simmering drifted through the air. "Set him on the rug by the fireplace," Martha instructed. "I'll get blankets." Ethan stepped inside, the warmth hitting him with such force he almost collapsed. He knelt beside the hearth, placing Ranger gently onto the thick, braided rug. Ranger let out a quiet sigh as the heat seeped into his bones. Ethan traced a hand along the dog's back, whispering, "You're safe now. You're really safe." The fire cracked softly, sparks floating upward like tiny fireflies. Martha returned with blankets, 2 wool, 1 fleece, and knelt beside Ranger. She draped them carefully, her hands gentler than Ethan expected. Ranger's eyelids fluttered at her touch. "He likes you," Ethan said quietly. "I hope so," Martha whispered. "I need him to." Ethan looked up, catching the flicker of pain in her expression. Something unspoken passed between them. An understanding forged not from shared experiences, but from shared loss. The wind screamed against the windows, but inside the only sound was the crackling fire and Ranger's gradually steadier breathing. Martha pressed her palm against the dog's side, then met Ethan's gaze. "For what it's worth," she said softly, "my door should have opened a lot sooner." Ethan shook his head. "You opened it when it mattered." She swallowed, voice catching. "My son would have wanted this." Ethan's breath faltered, just for a moment. Martha continued before he could respond. He spoke about you often, said you were good, said Ranger was family to your whole unit. A single tear slipped down Ethan's cheek. He didn't wipe it away. Then Martha's voice dropped to a whisper, one that shattered the last defense Ethan carried. You too. Sleep inside. Ethan bowed his head, a sob breaking free as he pulled Ranger closer. Not out of weakness, but out of gratitude so deep it hurt. The warmth of the house wrapped around Ethan so suddenly it nearly buckled his knees. After days of freezing wind and nights spent curled under overpasses, the soft heat rolling from Martha's wood-burning stove felt almost unreal, like stepping into a memory he no longer trusted. He lowered himself beside Ranger, who lay bundled in blankets before the crackling fire. The old dog stretched his legs slightly, releasing a sigh so tender it made Ethan's throat tighten. For the first time tonight, Ranger's ears relaxed from their rigid angle. Peaceful, trusting, safe. Ethan brushed a hand along Ranger's back, feeling the slow return of warmth beneath the dog's coat. You're all right now, he whispered. We made it inside, buddy. Behind him, Martha set a kettle on the stove. The soft clatter of metal against cast iron filled the room. She moved quietly, almost cautiously, as though her house wasn't used to sharing its warmth with strangers anymore. Still, she didn't hesitate. Every motion carried intention, measured, steady, human. Ethan gently pulled off his gloves. His fingertips burned as they thawed, pinking beneath the sudden heat. He hadn't realized how cold he'd been until the warmth stung. Winter safety advisories always warned about that. The painful tingling of circulation returning. But he'd stopped paying attention to such things long ago. You'll want something hot, Martha said, without turning around. Tea's all I've got tonight. Tea's perfect, ma'am, Ethan answered, his voice soft but steadier now, as though the heat were reviving more than just his body. Martha poured 2 mugs and set one beside him. Ethan wrapped both hands around it, savoring the heat seeping through the ceramic into his palms. He didn't drink yet, he just held it. Comfort was a strange thing, something he needed to ease into slowly. Martha knelt beside Ranger again, her hand hovering before gently resting atop the dog's blanket-covered shoulder. Ranger lifted his eyes toward her. Dark, tired, but no longer dulled by cold. He's a handsome boy, Martha murmured. Ethan's lips twitched into a faint smile. He used to be a terror, strong enough to knock down a grown man if he wanted to. And now? Martha asked. Now? Ethan whispered, stroking Ranger's head. Now he's the part of me I can't lose. The room settled into a deep, reflective quiet. The kind elders in small Montana towns appreciated. A silence that wasn't emptiness, but space to breathe, to mend, to remember. Martha rose slowly, wiping her hands on her apron. You look exhausted, she said gently. Both of you. You should get some rest. Ethan nodded, but didn't move from Ranger's side. I'll sleep right here, he said. If that's all right. Martha looked at him, really looked, as though seeing something not just in him, but in the empty spaces around him. "You sleep wherever you need to," she replied softly. "This house, it's got room." The simple kindness in her voice nearly undid him. Ethan cleared his throat, steadying himself. "Thank you, truly." "You don't owe me thanks," Martha said. Rate 87%, pitch tunist. "Not for this." She hesitated. "There's too much I didn't do in time for my boy. I'm not making that mistake twice." The words hung in the warm air, soft, yet heavy with truth. Ethan lowered his eyes, swallowed hard. "I'm sorry," he whispered, "for your loss." Martha nodded once, firm, accepting, but deeply sad. "Go on," she murmured. "Rest while the fire's hot. You look like you haven't slept in days." Ethan didn't deny it. He stretched out beside Ranger, pulling one of the blankets over himself. The fire popped softly, sending sparks upward, the heat loosening knots carved by long nights and longer memories. Ranger shifted closer, pressing his head against Ethan's chest. The dog's breathing, though still shallow, felt steadier, alive in a way that made hope bloom painfully inside Ethan's ribs. Martha dimmed the lights, leaving only the fire's glow. "You're not alone tonight," she said softly from the doorway. Ethan closed his eyes, letting the warmth and the words wash over him. For the first time in years, he believed them. The fire crackled softly, filling the quiet farmhouse with a patient, steady warmth. Outside, the storm still swept across the fields, but its roar felt far away now, as if the thick wooden walls of Martha's living room had turned it into nothing more than a distant memory. Ethan lay on his side beside Ranger, one hand resting gently over the dog's ribs. Every rise and fall calmed something inside him he hadn't been able to name in years. Martha returned from the kitchen carrying a folded quilt and a small tray with 2 mugs of tea. She set the tray on the coffee table, then placed the quilt across Ethan's legs. "That fire's strong," she said quietly. "But nights like these take more warmth than wood alone." Ethan nodded, his voice still hoarse from cold and emotion. "I'm grateful for all of it," he murmured. "You didn't have to let us in." Martha lowered herself into the armchair beside the hearth, clasping her hands together. "My boy would have wanted me to," she said. Her voice carried that same ache Ethan had heard earlier, soft, wounded, yet holding a strength shaped by years of surviving grief alone. For a while neither spoke. The fire filled the silence, its glow painting their faces in soft amber. Ranger exhaled a deep, steady breath, the kind he hadn't managed outside in the freezing wind. Then Martha said quietly, "Tell me how you and Ranger met." Ethan lifted his eyes, surprised by the gentleness in her request. He shifted slightly, adjusting the blanket around Ranger before answering. "He was assigned to me during my 3rd deployment," Ethan began, his tone dipping into a place where memory and pain intertwined. Scrawny thing back then. Fast as hell, though. Too smart for his own good. Martha smiled faintly. "Sounds like my son." always seeing things before the rest of us. Ethan nodded. Ranger had that sense, the kind that saved lives. He pulled me out from roadside blasts, alerted us to ambushes, and he knew when someone was panicking before they even said a word. Ethan paused, fingers brushing Ranger's fur with a tenderness that revealed everything unspoken. Some of us depended on him more than we depended on ourselves. Veterans support programs, mental health resources, words that floated around his life, useful in theory, unreachable in practice. But Ranger had been the only thing that truly kept him grounded when the world turned violent and confusing. "What about you?" Ethan asked gently. "Your son, he talked about the unit a lot?" Martha inhaled slowly, as if preparing herself to open a door she had kept locked far too long. "He wrote home often," she said. "Told me stories I didn't always understand, but I could feel the pride in his words." She swallowed, blinking back the sting behind her eyes. "He mentioned a quiet guy who took care of the K9. Said that dog was the bravest soul he'd ever met." Her gaze softened. "I didn't know he meant yours." Ethan lowered his head, unable to hold back the tremor in his chest. The firelight cast warm, living shadows across the room, something Ethan hadn't felt within himself in a very long time. Martha leaned forward slightly, her voice barely above a whisper. "When my boy died, the world went quiet. Not peaceful quiet. Just empty." Her hands trembled. "I didn't want to let anyone in. Didn't want to risk losing anything again." Ethan nodded slowly. "I understand." "I know you do," Martha replied. Another silence settled, but this one was gentle. Healing, not heavy. Ranger stirred, nudging Ethan's arm with his nose, seeking a familiar touch. Ethan smiled softly and stroked the dog's head. "You two still have a lot of life left in you," Martha said. "A lot more than you think." Ethan exhaled, a sound caught somewhere between relief and grief. "I hope so," he murmured. "For both of us." The fire flickered brighter for a moment, as though warming the space between them. Two broken souls, slowly remembering how to breathe in a world that had once taken too much. The fire burned low, its glow settling into a softer, sleepier pulse, warming the room like a gentle heartbeat. Outside, the storm had finally begun to ease, its roar shifting into a distant hush, like a warning fading, like a blessing arriving late but still welcomed. Ethan sat beside Ranger, one hand resting over the dog's chest, feeling each breath as if counting borrowed time. Martha stood, walked quietly to an old cabinet against the wall, and opened the top drawer. Inside were keepsakes she'd tucked away years before, some she hadn't touched since the funeral. Her fingers hesitated before lifting a single framed photograph. A young man in uniform, her son, smiling beside a desert tent, dust clinging to his gear, sunlight catching the creases around his determined eyes. She held the frame for a long, quiet moment before returning to the fireplace. She didn't sit this time. Instead, she knelt near Ethan and placed the photo on the floor between them, close enough for the firelight to illuminate it. Ethan froze. A quiet, broken sound escaped him before he could stop it. "That's—" His voice cracked. He swallowed hard. "That's Jacob." Martha nodded slowly. "Yes, my boy." Ethan's eyes dropped to the rug. His breath trembled, his hand tightening over Ranger's fur. "I didn't know he was yours," he whispered. I didn't know where he came from. Just that he talked about home a lot. Talked about you." Martha pressed her lips together, bracing herself. "What did he say?" Ethan exhaled shakily, letting the memory rise from the place he'd buried it deep. "He said you made the best cornbread in the county. Said you'd kill him if he ever showed up without calling first. Said he missed you every damn day." Martha closed her eyes, fighting back tears. The room felt smaller now, fuller, heavier, more alive with the echoes of someone they had both loved in different ways. Ethan lowered his head. "I made him a promise," he whispered. Martha's breath halted. Ethan's words quivered as they left his chest, soaked in guilt and memory. "I told him I'd get him home. I told him I'd make sure he came back to you safe." He didn't look at her. He couldn't. The weight of the unkept promise crushed his shoulders until he felt himself fold beneath it. Ranger lifted his head, sensing the shift, and pressed his nose to Ethan's wrist. A quiet reminder that pain shared didn't have to destroy. Martha's eyes filled. Not with anger, not with blame, but with the terrible understanding of someone who had carried her own unspoken guilt for years. "You did what you could," she whispered. Ethan shook his head. "It wasn't enough." "You are not the reason he didn't come home," Martha said firmly. "War takes what it wants. It doesn't ask. It doesn't wait. It doesn't care what promises are made." A tear slid down Ethan's cheek. Martha reached out, hesitant at first, then gently placed her hand over his. Her grip was warm, steady, human. "My son trusted you," she said softly. "That's the part that matters. And if he were here, he'd tell you the same." Ethan's shoulders trembled. A man unraveling, but finally allowed to do so. "I've carried it for so long," he admitted. "This weight, this failure." "Then let it rest," Martha whispered. "At least for tonight." Ranger shifted again, curling closer to Ethan's ribs. His breathing, though still shallow, had steadied with the warmth of the fire and the quiet of the room. He nudged Ethan's chin gently, an old gesture that said too much in too few words. Martha wiped her eyes and picked up the photo frame, placing it carefully on the mantel above the fire, close enough to watch over them. "Jacob would have been glad you two made it here," she said. "He would have opened the door the moment you knocked." Ethan bowed his head, breath quivering. "I wish it had been him." Martha inhaled a trembling breath. So do I. The fire popped softly, sending a wave of warmth through the room, and for the first time since her son's death, Martha felt something inside her uncoil, just slightly. And Ethan, still holding Ranger close, felt a piece of the weight he'd carried for years finally shift. Not gone, but no longer his alone. The storm had passed overnight, leaving the world outside muffled in white. Snow draped over the fences, the trees, the barn roof, softening the hard edges of the night that had nearly broken them all. Inside, the fire was still alive, glowing embers breathing warmth into the living room. Ethan woke to its gentle crackle, his hand automatically reaching for Ranger before he even opened his eyes. The dog stirred under the quilt, his breathing steadier, his fur warm beneath Ethan's palm. Relief washed over him, slow and profound. "Morning, buddy," he whispered. Ranger opened his eyes, just a sliver, and gave Ethan the smallest wag of his tail. But it was there. It was real. Ethan's throat tightened. After the night they'd survived, even the smallest movement felt like a miracle. From the kitchen, the faint clink of dishes drifted into the room. Martha was already awake, probably had been for hours. People who lived alone often moved with the dawn, chores to do, routines to keep, little things that held the day together like invisible stitching. Ethan sat up stiffly, joints protesting after sleeping on the floor. He wrapped the blanket tighter around Ranger before rising to his feet. His muscles ached from cold and tension, but something else filled him too. A warmth he hadn't felt in years, a feeling dangerously close to hope. Martha glanced over her shoulder as he approached the kitchen doorway. "Coffee's on," she said simply. She didn't force a smile, but there was a softness in her voice that hadn't been there before. Ethan nodded, rubbing the back of his neck. "Smells good. Thank you." "You look like you haven't had a hot breakfast in a while," she replied, sliding a plate onto the table, 2 eggs, toast, and potatoes fried golden at the edges. "I haven't," Ethan admitted quietly. "Not in more days than I care to count." Martha poured him a mug of black coffee and set it down. "Sit. Eat. I'm not letting you go back out there on an empty stomach." He hesitated, not out of pride this time, but out of uncertainty about his place in this home. Then Ranger let out a soft huff from the living room, reminding him he wasn't the only one depending on warmth now. Ethan sat, took a sip of coffee, and felt the heat spread through his chest. It means more than you know." Martha didn't answer right away. She leaned against the counter, arms folded, watching the snow-draped morning through the window. "I checked on Ranger earlier," she said finally. "He's warmer. Still weak, but warmer." Ethan nodded. "He'll need proper pet wellness care soon. A vet, maybe some meds." He exhaled, a long breath of truth. "I don't have much. I haven't worked steady since—" He trailed off. Martha finished for him. "Since you lost your team." His jaw clenched. He met her eyes. Not defensive, just honest. Yeah. She stepped closer, her boots tapping softly against the wooden floor. There are programs that help veterans, financial support, mental health services. You should apply. I know, Ethan murmured. Just didn't think I deserved it. Martha's gaze sharpened, but not unkindly. My son would have kicked your behind for saying that. Despite everything, the night, the storm, the ache still inside him. Ethan smiled, really smiled. He probably would have. The kitchen warmed with a shared quiet, the kind that made grief feel less like a burden and more like a bridge. When Ethan finished eating, he carried his mug to the sink. Outside, sunlight glinted off the snow, turning the whole world into a field of diamonds. Martha joined him at the window. If you two need a place for a while, she said, her voice gentle but certain, this house has room. Ethan didn't speak at first. He couldn't. His throat tightened as the meaning of her words settled into him. Warm, steady, real. We don't want to be a burden. You're not, Martha said firmly. You're exactly where you're supposed to be. Behind them, Ranger let out a sleepy bark, soft but hopeful. And for the first time in years, Ethan believed that maybe, just maybe, the path forward didn't have to be walked alone. Morning broke gently over Montana, spreading soft gold across the snow-covered fields. The storm had washed the land clean, leaving a silence so pure it felt almost sacred. Ethan stepped onto the porch, exhaling into the cold air as the sunlight warmed the horizon. For once, the cold didn't bite. It simply reminded him he was alive. Ranger followed, wrapped in Martha's old knitted sweater. He moved slowly, but with purpose, sniffing the frosty air before settling at Ethan's feet. His breathing was steadier, his eyes clearer. A quiet confirmation that he had made it through the darkest night of his life. Ethan rubbed Ranger's neck. We made it, buddy. We really made it. The screen door clicked open behind them. Martha walked out carrying 2 steaming mugs, her breath curling in soft white clouds. She handed Ethan one and sank into the rocking chair beside him. Coffee, she said. Nothing fancy. It's perfect, Ethan replied, wrapping his hands around the mug. Inside, warmth spread through him. Real warmth. Not just heat from the stove, but something deeper. Human. Healing. The 3 of them sat in a comfortable silence. The fields shimmered under the morning sun, and the old barn, weather-beaten, stoic, looked less like a place of fear and more like a guardian watching over them. He looks better today, Martha said, nodding toward Ranger. Ethan smiled softly. Thanks to you. Martha didn't answer right away. Her eyes drifted across the fields, the way someone's do when remembering something long kept inside. It's strange, she murmured. This house has felt empty for so long, but with the 2 of you here, it feels different. Ethan took a slow breath. It's been a long time since anywhere felt like a place I belonged. You're healing, she said quietly. Both of you. Ranger let out a single, soft bark, as if agreeing. Martha turned to Ethan, studying him with the tender, honest gaze only a mother could give. "How long are you planning to stay?" she asked. Ethan hesitated. "I don't want to be a burden. I've got to find work, get the truck running, figure out care for Ranger. Life's complicated." "Life's always complicated," Martha replied gently. "But it doesn't have to be lived alone." Ethan looked at her, really looked, and something inside him eased for the first time in years. The tension in his shoulders loosened. The tightness in his throat softened. "Martha, thank you," he whispered, "for letting us in, for everything." "You gave me something too," she said. "A reason to open this door again." Ranger nudged Ethan's hand, tail wagging weakly. Ethan pressed his forehead against the dog's. "We're safe now." The sun climbed higher, stretching their shadows across the porch. A soldier learning to breathe again. A mother learning to let life back in. And a dog who had carried them both through the darkest places. They didn't need to say the words out loud. They weren't alone anymore. And that was enough.